Okay, if I could have your attention, I'm Dan Householder, President. We've got some business to take care of. Tom Ewert is going to introduce the people that he has gotten to accept some nominations
for next year.
For next year.
Yeah. So our bylaws say that we're supposed to present the slate 30 days in advance, and we presented a slate, but there's been some changes. So I'm going to announce who has agreed to serve as officers next year, and then I'm going to ask for a nomination from the floor for two of them. We're switching around a little bit. So just what the bylaws are. Mark Nolan has agreed to be our vice president, which means we have an opening for the regular board position. Kevin Gronewig is our treasurer. Yeah, would you come up so everybody can see your beautiful faces. Secretary is Barbara Galbert again for another year. Mark is here.
I'm here.
I don't know how we get back. Got a cap on, I didn't recognize it. Jennifer Bruey is nominee for the board member, and we've asked Jeremy Coleman to also be a board member. So I need a nomination from the floor to accept the changes, which is Mark and Jeremy Coleman.
So moved.
We have a second? Second. Mr. President, I make a motion that we accept the board members by acclamation, and unless there's any objections.
Any additional nominations? Then all in favor of the list of officers for next year, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. They're elected. Thank you. The other thing that I need to ask you, going forward, we are going to need a chairman of the Chaplain Nature Center Committee and a new chairman of the Field Trip Committee. So anybody who is interested in either of those two things, let me know, and you can be you can be a committee chairman. You don't have to be on the board to be a committee chairman. Kevin, do you want to introduce the program?
Okay.
Thank you.
A couple of other things coming up, since this is our last program meeting of the season. We won't start up again until September. So a few things happening in the meantime. One thing I wanted to mention, if you didn't see it in the newsletter, is we're having an open house at Chaplain Nature Center. And so we built a new house for a naturalist, and he's going to show it off. It's complete, and so that's June 18. That's a Saturday from 1 to 5 o'clock. And then a couple other things. We've also got a field trip, which is something a little different, a wildflower walk. And so that'll be here at Chisholm Creek Park. That's June 25th, 8 to 10 a.m. So I think is Sandra leading that? Or who's leading that? Or you,
Us both.
Okay. Also, butterflies, birds, whatever we see, but wildflowers will be the focus on that one. And then, of course, our annual butterfly count, the Arc City Butterfly Count. That's happening July 9th, beginning at 9 o'clock. So, and you don't need to be an experienced butterflyer. If you have a set of eyes, that's all that's required. So there'll be people with some experience. So try to find as many butterflies as you can see. Okay, with that, I'll introduce our speaker for this evening. Laura Mendenhall grew up in Olathe. She did her undergraduate studies in conservation biology at K-State and her graduate studies at Duke University. She's been a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the past 10 years and lives in rural Riley County. She enjoys hunting, birding, as well as landscaping with native plants, as you will see, and currently serves on the board of the Kansas Wildlife Federation. So please welcome Laura.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Mhm.
Great. So thank you for having me back. It's so good to be in person. It's been a long 2 years of virtual events, so it's nice seeing everyone's faces. I last spoke to this group about 7 years ago, and the topic was California condor biology. And so now it's great to be back and talking about native plants. I feel confident that native plants have sort of supplanted condors in my mind as my favorite thing to talk about. So thanks for letting me do that. So tonight I will be talking about the fundamentals of introducing some native plants to your landscaping. So we'll talk about why and how to do it. And when I was putting together this presentation, I sort of assumed that the audience would run the gamut of never having seen or touched a native plant all the way to you've completely overhauled your landscape to include natives. And so that's okay. So let's say you're one of the ones who has planted some natives, like this beautiful common milkweed. A lot of this will be review, but it is really important, of course, to always review the fundamentals. And my challenge to you tonight is to walk away with some more knowledge and motivation to then convert someone else to planting with natives. So think about that. Now, if you are on the other side of the spectrum and you've never touched a native plant or thought about incorporating native plants in your yard, maybe this is your house and your yard, that's okay too. I hope you will walk away learning some new things, mostly why we should plant native plants and how to do it easily and how to do it without upsetting your neighbors, which is so important. And so my goal for you tonight is to walk away thinking about how you can replace even just one of these, for example, non-native boxwood bushes with a native alternative of a similar size and structure. So that's your goal for tonight. And then I'm also going to briefly talk about the National Wildlife Federation's Gardening for Wildlife program. It's also called the Certified Wildlife Habitat Program. And it's something that at Kansas Wildlife Federation we like to promote. It's a really neat program. It's a great way to showcase your conservation effort in your very own yard. You just have to meet a few criteria. You've got to provide food, water, shelter, and some other things. There's a whole checklist, which we'll get into later. And then you can be certified officially through the National Wildlife Federation. And one thing that's great about that is you can get a cool sign to put in your yard. And so we'll talk about the importance of using signs when you're using native plants. So let's talk about the current landscaping paradigm. This is pretty much it. So this house is just a random house from Zillow, but in the Wichita area. So hopefully none of you actually live here because I'm about to shred what they've done. But so this is entirely non-native. Every plant you see in this picture is not native to North America. And so as a biologist, we see this and think biological wasteland. This is not supporting any of our native creatures. You may see the occasional insect or bird fly through, but there's really not good food sources here. This is a broken system. And the North American lawn is the most widely planted crop in North America, or in the United States. So think about that. It's the most widely planted crop, and we don't even eat it. And every year, this takes about 67 million pounds of pesticides to control and maintain. So that's a huge impact. And especially when you multiply that by, tens, hundreds of thousands, that represents a lot of habitat loss. And so it's particularly distressing to me and probably to you all as birders. You get all around the state and you get to experience all of our amazing ecoregions. We have so many plants to offer. And so it's just a real shame that we've settled on lacebark elm and boxwood bushes and spirea and pampas grass when we have so many amazing and interesting and aesthetically pleasing trees and wildflowers and bunch grasses. So when we talk about planting or landscaping with native plants, what we're really getting after is trying to restore food webs. So that picture of that house I showed you before is a broken food web. There's nothing there connected. And this is a good illustration because it shows the plant at the bottom. That's really the foundation. That's the primary producer. It's converting sunlight to energy. and everything else bases on that plant. And so a lot of our insects have co-evolved with specific plants. So a good example that most people are familiar with is the monarch butterfly. In its larval form, it can only feed on milkweed plants, of which we have about 20 native species in Kansas. So, and a lot of bumblebees and different kinds of bees have mouth parts that are shaped to where they can only access nectar and pollen from specific flowers. So there's a lot of intricate coevolution going on. And when you replace that plant at the very bottom with a non-native plant, a lot of times the insects aren't going to know what to do with that. And so there is a famous entomologist, and I'll be referring to him a lot in this presentation. His name's Douglas Tallamy. He's written some fantastic books. But he did a study looking at native plants and caterpillars and birds, and he found that the average Carolina chickadee pair to raise one clutch of eggs required 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars for one clutch. That's a tremendous amount of caterpillars. And if you remove the native oak trees from the system, so they're the ones that are really bringing in a lot of caterpillars, you're not going to have anything. So you're not going to have chickadees. And that really makes sense when you see data like this. So, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but the big study published in 2019 that showed 2.9 billion birds have been lost in North America since 1970. So a lot of that is grassland birds too. So grassland birds have suffered about a 52% decline. We've lost over 700 million of them. So if we continue on this trend of habitat loss and degradation, we're going to see a lot more impacts, and impacts to humans as well. Another group of birds that was found to be highly affected is the aerial insectivores. And so they have gone down by over 100 million since 1970. And as birders, we're pretty good at appreciating birds for their intrinsic value. But with insectivores and some of these other species, you can kind of think about the ecosystem services. And if these birds are lost, what that's going to do to humans. And then there's also this concept of nature deficit disorder and a loss of ecological knowledge and how to be stewards of the land. And so this author talks about nature deficit disorder as a disconnect from nature such that we're experiencing all kinds of mental issues. So loss of our ability to use our five senses fully. And the loss of the ability to focus and concentrate when you're disconnected from nature, and then also an increase in physical and mental illnesses. And so this is a huge problem. It's concerning for me as a parent of a 3-year-old and a baby. I want my kids to not be disconnected from nature. And then there's also this concept of shifting baseline syndrome, where the prairie that I knew and grew up with is different from the prairie that my daughter sees because of this trend of loss of biodiversity. So I'm here to tell you that incorporating native plants into your landscape is one way to help counteract what's happening here. And then you may be familiar with the insect apocalypse. There was that big study that came out within the last, 5-10 years about a global decline in insects. And what the authors found was a lot of the insects in decline were really generalist species. So that makes up a huge amount of biomass that help connect our primary producers, which are the plants, to our consumers like birds. So again, a lot of repercussions with a global insect apocalypse. And the name is scary enough. And then of course, most people are familiar with the decline of the monarch and loss of habitat, loss of milkweed. And then there are other species that as Fish and Wildlife Service biologists, we're seeing more species be petitioned for listing on the Endangered Species Act. So American bumblebee being the most recent pollinator species. So highly concerning. And then we've all been sold this idea that if we just switch out our single-use grocery sacks and our single-use bottles, that's enough. And that's enough environmentalism, conservation, like that's being proactive and we can feel good about ourselves. But it's really it's not enough. Of course you should be doing these things, but we should be doing so much more. And landscaping with native plants, I believe, is a really tangible and meaningful way to actually take that next step and do more for conservation. But it's hard when we are just awash in misinformation and corporate greenwashing. And so this was a prominent example from a few years back. This was the Honey Nut Cheerios Save the Bee campaign that was going around on social media. And so the whole premise behind it was you could go and sign up and they would send you a packet of wildflower seeds and you were doing your part to save the honeybee. Well, the honeybee isn't even native to North America. We have almost 3,000 species of native bees native to North America. The honeybee is not one of them. And I like how Rich Hatfield with Xerces Society always talks about honeybees as if they're livestock. And they really are. They play an important role in agriculture, but not so much in our ecosystem functioning. And so people would go on, sign up, get their wildflower packets, and feel really good. Well, the packets contained seeds from species that weren't even native to North America, and in some cases were invasive. So not only was this not doing any good, it was like actively doing harm. So this was like very, very difficult as a biologist on social media to see like everybody's sharing this and being excited about it and having to say, well, actually, this isn't very helpful. Okay, so this is that entomologist, Doug Tallamy. Highly recommend reading these two books. He's got some great just tips on how to incorporate native plants and more importantly, just the why. And he does all the research and counts the insects and fabulous books, but he firmly believes that if we can sort of reverse the course of the suburbs in particular, so his focus is really on suburban landscapes, he thinks we can turn this thing around and sort of reverse the decline of a lot of our native wildlife species in North America. And so that rests on you and me. You know, we have control over our yards in the suburbs. So to me, that's really empowering. And this is the way to make change. And so he says that imagine if we all just converted even half of our yards to featuring native plants. We would restore something like 20 million acres of ecological function. So let that empower you. So how are we going to do it? How are we going to change this monstrosity? I guess I'll start with talking about the plants that you don't want to plant, because a lot of people don't know. And you really can't blame people because this house is what we're comfortable with, right? Like this is what we've known for decades. When you walk into Home Depot, these are the plants that are available for sale. They're relatively cheap. We know how to take care of them. So you can't blame people too much. It's going to be a slow and steady campaign to educate folks, show by example, and then make these actual changes so we can achieve that 20 million acres of habitat restoration. So what not to plant? So in the upper left, you all probably recognize that. That's some kind of a Pampas grass, native to Argentina. It's a grassland species, but native to South America. Upper right, typical fescue lawn, chemical intensive. You need to mow it all the time. Lower left is some kind of fountain grass that's been really popular. It's from Asia. And then lower right is a New Guinean patient. And I grew up thinking like that was just a cute name for the flower, but it literally is native to Papua New Guinea. Like it's coming from the South Pacific. It's native to the South Pacific. So it's just kind of mind-boggling that this is so commonly planted here in North America. And then upper left, this one kills me because it's a butterfly bush. And it's so well marketed to people who want to do good for pollinators. And it does do some good. If you've got a butterfly bush, you've probably seen butterflies and bees nectaring on it. So it does fill a role with some of the more generalist species. But Doug Tallamy always talks about how our native plants, really from seed to flower to fruit, they're providing some kind of service every step of the way to different insects. That's not the case for native plants. And so maybe the butterfly bush is good when it's fully in bloom and able to provide nectar and pollen to some of our generalist species, but it's not a food source for their larval form. The upper right is a Spirea bush, also not native. And then lower left is Bradford pear. And so that one is just so popular, but it's a garbage tree for North America. I'm sorry if I burst anyone's bubbles, but yeah, it doesn't do anything positively for the ecosystem, and it's actually become invasive. So it does a really good job at reproducing. And so you'll see this thing taking over pastures and prairies. A lot in Missouri, and Missouri's actually done a really good job campaigning against purchase of this plant, and they have like buyback programs for Bradford pear. Here, my husband and I were just noticing on 254, when you're headed west out of El Dorado, there's a whole huge pasture that's just covered in Bradford pear saplings. So really hard to see, hard to remove, not a good tree. And then the lower right is sort of the ubiquitous sign of spring, right? Daffodils. But they're not native to North America. They don't really serve a function for our pollinators. People like them because they're early spring bloomers. And what people don't realize is that we actually do have a fair amount of early spring bloomers. They're just hard to find because they're these kind of small woodland ephemeral species like trout lily, mayapple. So there are early spring bloomers out there, but it's just not this showy, ostentatious daffodil. So where do you go to get native plants? Because you're not going to find them at Home Depot, typically. Not yet, anyway. We've got to put more pressure on them. You all are lucky because you're close to Heston, where the Dick Arboretum is. And this is a picture from their native plant sale. They have 2 sales a year. We've already missed the spring one. It was in April. But you have another shot in September. They do have a native plant sale. And the fall is actually a really good time to plant natives, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is a fantastic resource that's fairly close to y'all. Heston is a cool town. The Arboretum is nice to visit. And you can show up there with just kind of an idea of where you want to plant things, but maybe you don't know which species. And there's really helpful folks there who will help you select the best species for your site. I go every year. It's kind of overwhelming for me as a native plant enthusiast to walk into this greenhouse and just like all the native plants. It's very exciting. I always spend way too much money. But so this is a fabulous resource. And then we also have Monarch Watch in Lawrence, another great resource. They do an in-person sale in the spring. They also do mail order plants. And if you've never ordered live plants online to be shipped, it actually isn't too bad. They show up in a little box, they're alive, just take them out, water them, get them in the ground, they're fine. I've done it multiple times. So Monarch Watch in Lawrence. And then Prairie Moon Nursery is a really good one. They have a pretty wide variety of actual plants, root, stock, and then also seeds. And I'll talk about seeds here in a minute. But Prairie Moon Nursery, and I don't remember where, I think they're in Wisconsin, they're somewhere up north. But they do strive to source seeds from local ecotypes. So think about that. And then the National Wildlife Federation has a brand new program they just launched this year where you go online, you can enter in your zip code, and it'll filter out what plants they have available that'll be appropriate for your area. And this one is heavily focused on ecotypes. And ecotype is just a version of a species that's adapted for your area. So the butterfly milkweed that's native to Sedgwick County might be a little bit different than the butterfly milkweed native to, 4 counties over to the east or west. So National Wildlife Federation really good at trying to select the local ecotype for you. And these are fully, little plants, so they'll mail them to you. And then of course there's seeds. So seeds are going to be cheaper and maybe a little bit easier to come by. And there's the option of you going out and collecting seeds yourself, which is a really fun hobby. You do have to be careful where you are able to do it. Some public lands, you're not allowed to go out and collect seeds, but you end up getting savvy about it, and you'll be, driving down the highway and see a milkweed that's gone to seed. You can pull off and grab it if it's in the easement. And so seeds are typically cheaper. If you know a friend who has native plants in their garden, you can arrange to go collect seeds in the fall or winter. With our native seeds, they do have to cold stratify, which just means they need 3 months of cold before they're going to germinate in the spring. So what I always do is I'll collect my seeds in the fall or November, December, and then I'll just put them in an envelope and throw them in my refrigerator for 3 months. And then come springtime, I'll go and plant them. When you are collecting seeds, I recommend collecting from multiple individuals of the same species. You don't want to completely denude one plant of all of its seeds because, of course, there's wildlife out there depending on those seeds as well. And then also you want to maximize your chances of having viable seeds. So I recommend collecting a little bit of seed from a lot of different plants of the same species. And then I like to, when I have seeds, I will grow them in little pots. so that I know what to expect. Then I transplant them into my garden. If you put your seeds into your garden, you do run the risk of like a rainstorm coming and washing them all around or washing them out. And then also when you're weeding, you may accidentally pick the seed that you want to grow because you may not be familiar with what it looks like in its young stage. So I recommend if you are going to go the seed route to try and plant them in pots and then transplant them. For beginner native plant gardeners, I mostly recommend using little plants. You get the gratification a little bit sooner. You can see the neat foliage and the flowers a little bit sooner. Whereas with seeds, it's going to take a couple seasons. So it takes a little bit of patience. But seeds are cheaper. Plants run about anywhere from like $4 to $7 depending on the size. But a lot of these plants, like a Dick Arboretum, they're perennials. So you're making that initial investment. And I recommend if you're just starting out to do that kind of remove and replace approach. So as I mentioned in the beginning with those non-native boxwoods, maybe buy like 1 or 2 native plants, maybe 3, and just remove the boxwood, place the 3 there. That's about $15, $20, and you'll have it come back every year and grow bigger every year, and you can collect seed from it. So it is an investment. Okay, so what do native plants look like in formal landscaping? So the big thing is we don't want to upset our neighbors. So I'm not advocating you go and plant a giant prairie in your front yard. And that's not good for this movement either. Like we need people to understand that native plants can be pretty and they can work in formal landscaping. So this is an example of a bigger yard in rural Butler County. And this homeowner used a tall grass seed mix, and he just seeded along his driveway, and then his lawn is just mowed prairie. So what's important here and why this works is the clean distinction between the mowed turf and the kind of wild prairie. So we always advocate for like a clear margin. If you're going to do like a wilder prairie look with mixed species, you want to have a clear margin, a distinction between that wild look and then a clean lawn. So kind of that juxtaposition, that tends to work well. I also advocate for just starting small. And so this is a little bed that's bounded on all sides by hardscape. So again, it's kind of wild looking, but it's close, you know, it's kept in this little bed and it's mowed grass all around and hardscape. And this one I planted a mixture of seed and plants, and I spaced everything close enough to where I wouldn't have to worry too much about weeds encroaching. This wasn't too difficult to weed because the natives crowded out any potential weeds. And then I also generally don't use mulch. Mulch can be difficult with some of our ground nesting bees accessing the ground and then also coming back out. So I tend to prefer just planting things close enough to where you kind of just don't need mulch. And then this is another great example of a totally native yard. So this is a buffalo grass lawn. So that's a native shortgrass prairie species. And then she has, so up against her house, she's kind of grouped species together. So Brad Gurr up at the Dick Arboretum, he's one of the biologists there. He always recommends to plant in groupings of at least 3 to 5. So you have kind of that clean look, uniformity. It approximates the formal landscaping that we're all sort of used to. So she's done that around her house. And then the bed that kind of creeps out to the road, she's allowed it to look more like a prairie, but it works because she has that clean landscaping line between the bed and the grass. And she also has a sign, which I didn't get a picture of, but she has a sign indicating what she's doing here. And to my knowledge, no complaints about this yard from neighbors. And then this is another example of just adhering to that the grouping 3 to 5 of the same species in one area kind of creates that nice uniformity. And then a clear delineation between your native bed and the surrounding landscape. And here's another view. And then this bed, we tried to select flowers to maximize nectar availability across the season. So once you get a little better at native plant landscaping or more into it, you can really focus on making sure there's nectar available from April to October. And that's to allow migrating monarchs to feed, all manner of bees. Everything is on a different phenology. So certain things are coming out in April, insects that need to nectar, all the way to October. So it's really nice to have like a wave of different blossoms throughout the year. So purple poppy mallow is the predominant flower you see here, and that one is an early bloomer. It's a cool season plant. And then you've got butterfly milkweed, there's a Liatris species. So this one really did a good job of providing that nectar for our pollinators all season long. And then this is an example of, again, grouping species together. But also you'll notice some of our tall grass species are they can get tall and spindly, and it doesn't really work in a landscape when you just have one or two of an individual. So if you plant 25, like I did, it works. They sort of support each other, and they look less spindly and sort of weak. So this is a very striking bloom that happens. It's in that same bed that I showed you from before. This is at the Air Force Base. And this bloom is happening late September, early October, which is so cool. Like, did you know we had a flower that blooms in the fall that's not a mum, a non-native mum? This is a Liatris, and a friend of mine collected the seed in the Red Hills, and then we grew them in pots and transplanted them. So, doing really well. And then these are just some other examples. So upper left, if you've got shady spots in your yard where moisture tends to collect, sedges are a good choice for you. That's the genus Carex. You can find those at Dig Arboretum. They make a lovely, soft, carpeted landscape. And then upper right is little blue stem. That's a great bunch grass. It turns a gorgeous reddish-brown color in the fall and produces these white, fluffy seeds. So it's really beautiful year-round. And then lower left is coneflower, which is one of those tall grass prairie species that gets a little bit spindly and leggy. But if you plant it with something bushier and fuller, it works. So this one's paired with a prairie drop seed, which is a nice bunch grass. And then lower right is another example of a buffalo grass lawn. So buffalo grass lawn, once you get them established, it's a process to get them established, but then theoretically they're lower maintenance, and you don't have to irrigate, they're pretty drought tolerant, and you mow less frequently with buffalo grass. It's a short grass species, so it's not going to get that tall. Okay, so some replacements for some of those common ones. The upper Pampas grass or fountain grass, if you're going to take that out, so remove, replace it with switchgrass. So switchgrass is a nice native bunch grass. And then lower left, that, whatever that is, maidenhair, I don't remember what that one's called. It's not native to here, so it doesn't matter. But if you're going to remove that one, prairie dropseed is a great alternative choice there. And I should mention a lot of our natives, because they are native to this place, they are drought tolerant. So with the bed on the Air Force Base that I showed you, we planted that in the fall, watered it once, ever, and then it was good to go. Never had to water it again. Now that's not going to be the case all the time. If we're in a severe drought and your plants are looking thirsty, you may give them a little bit of water. But in general, these are going to be pretty hardy, tolerant plants. And then if you got that dreaded butterfly bush and want to get rid of it, button bush is a great alternative. It's Ceanothus is the genus. It's a gorgeous little bush. You'll find it growing naturally along the Ark River. And then if you want to get rid of that dreaded Bradford pear, I highly recommend the Eastern redbud. A beautiful, showy spring flower tree. And it's pretty, it's small enough to where you can plant it in a yard. It's not going to get crazily big. And that's just an up close of that button bush. So really beautiful flowers. And then if you are going to certify with the National Wildlife Federation, planting native plants is a good first step because you knock out like 3 of the 5 criteria. You can check them off. So you do need to provide food, water, cover, places to raise young, and you need to utilize sustainable practices in your yard. So that can be anything from not using pesticides to when you are cutting off your old top growth, your dead top growth in winter, cutting it in such a way where you're not going to hurt any of the pollinators that are maybe overwintering in those stalks. So little things like that. In my yard, I have a ton of native plants, so I'm able to check off most of these boxes. And then a bird bath would be great for water, or I have what's called a butterfly puddler. It's literally just a terracotta dish with some mud in it that I keep moist. And so it allows butterflies to come in and get their minerals. And so there's a great checklist online. So if you just search National Wildlife Federation, Garden for Wildlife, or Certified Wildlife Habitat, this will come up. This is a really fun project to do as a family or with kids, to go in and make sure you check off what you what you have in your yard and maybe identify what more you need in order to certify. And so when you do certify, you have the option of purchasing a sign. So in the right is the sign that you get if you certify with National Wildlife Federation. On the left is an example sign from Xerces Society. Lots of different nonprofits offer different sign options. I do highly recommend using signs to let your neighbors know that what you're trying to do is intentional. Especially if you're going the seed route, it's going to look scraggly the first season. So you don't want people to think you just neglected your yard. You want them to know what you're doing is intentional and it matters, and that these signs will help sort of educate why you're doing it. And then so going back to that chickadee example, Doug Tallamy, the entomologist, so he went out and investigated 2 different trees on this as a part of this study. He investigated a native white oak and a Bradford pear. On the white oak, he found hundreds of caterpillars representing 19 species. On the Bradford pear, he found 1 caterpillar. That's it. And who knows why it was even there. Like maybe a bird dropped it and it landed on the dreaded Bradford pear. So that just illustrates you want to stay native. And oaks are huge. He's a big proponent of oaks and choosing native oaks, especially if you like birds. Of course, the monarch migration, if you do decide to plant native and you plant monarchs,